Welcome to Backlash Unfiltered, a podcast series by Unrest. Through in-depth conversations with leading scholars, activists, and policymakers, we will explore the rise of anti-gender movements, their impact on social development, and the historical and geopolitical forces that sustain them. This series is not just about understanding the backlash. It is also about resilience and imagining a fairer future.
Welcome to this episode of Backlash Unfiltered. My name is Anna Eknor-Axel, and I'm a research analyst with the Gender Justice and Development team here at Unrest. Today we have the privilege of sitting down with Neil Datta to explore the European funding landscape of anti-gender movements, their motivations, and their impact. Neil Datta is Executive Director for the European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights. He founded the organization with a select group of parliamentarians and with the support of the International Planned Parenthood Federation in the year 2000, and has been responsible for its growth to its current membership of over 30 all-party parliamentary groups on population and development issues. And so adding to his already great contributions to the fields of sexual and reproductive health and rights, international development, and gender justice, he has also published a series of reports on anti-gender movements, which we will learn more about today. So please welcome Neil. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So what exactly are anti-gender movements? How would you describe this phenomena or set of phenomena?
Yeah, excellent question. So anti-gender movements are a phenomenon that has emerged in Europe, I would say, over the past 15 years, which has certain specificities. So it's not just the old anti-abortion movement that we know has existed in this region since the 1970s or 80s. It's something new, but it builds upon the anti-abortion movement. Some of the key things about the anti-gender movement are its expanded range of targets. So, which is what makes it different from the anti-abortion. It has 5 main targets. One is everything in sexual and reproductive health and rights. So that's abortion, but it's also contraception. It's also assisted reproduction, even divorce. The second target is everything LGBTQ. Okay, so not just equal marriage, but co-adoption, trans rights, and even non-discrimination, if they can get away with this in certain contexts. A third area that we often overlook is that of children's rights, and specifically that sensitive point about who has the final say in determining the best interests of the child. Is it the family, which is for them heterosexual, patriarchal, traditional family, or may the state intervene in order to protect the best interests of the child? For example, this plays out in Nordic countries, which have a very progressive child protection system, such as in Norway and Sweden, which may create conflict with traditional perceptions of the family, and it also plays out, for example, in comprehensive sexuality education. A fourth area is that of gender, and we don't need to think too much what do they mean or what is meant by gender. We simply need to put the word gender somewhere to provoke an allergic reaction. So that's gender studies, GBV, gender-based violence, gender mainstreaming, gender budgeting, etc. And then the final area is that of what they call religious freedom. And what is meant by this, according to them, is my right to religious freedom, usually as a Christian, is more important than your right to access healthcare as a woman, or your right as a sexual minority to be protected from non-discrimination. If I can justify this based on religion, then the religious right trumps other rights. So that's the broadened area of anti-gender activism. And then over the past 15 years, a few key trends have taken place, which are useful to keep in mind, which also make it different from the anti-abortion activism of the 1980s and 90s. A first trend is that of transnational networking, so that all these groups at national level, they have found each other and they have established networks like every other sector in society in Europe. But they are doing this now. And it's important to realize this so that when we see similar things happening in different countries, it's not And it's not a coincidence. It's because it's been coordinated in a certain way. Okay. So transnational networking. Another one is professionalization. They are no longer the same groups that would simply be content making some weird billboard sign and then standing outside of an abortion clinic chanting or screaming. Now they know how power works. They understand how the EU works, how the UN, how the national parliaments and governments work, and they are busy presenting amendments, texts, resolutions, draft laws and bills, and they are being successful in presenting them, and they have allies within all of those places that are able to run with them. So that is one degree of professionalization. And also, for example, litigation, perhaps the highest level of professionalization. And then the third area, which is sometimes something that we overlook, is that of they have been able to renew their generations, okay, or renew their leadership. When I took a look at this movement operating in Brussels 20 years ago, what I found was mainly a small group of rather elderly men. And I thought very cynically, well, we just need to be patient and then the problem will resolve itself. I had completely underestimated the capacity that they had for building a whole new generation of leadership, so that now the leaders of this anti-rights movement, they are young, well-educated, and they are as likely to be a woman as they are a man.
With discussing your report, Tip of the Iceberg, full title would be Tip of the Iceberg, Religious Extremist Funders Against Human Rights for Sexuality and Reproductive Health in Europe between the years of 2009 and 2018. And it is in this report in which you, with great detail and really strong and robust figures to back it, provide a comprehensive analysis of the funding landscape and implications of anti-gender movements in Europe. So, could you please tell us more about the report and maybe also give us an overview of who is it that are funding the backlash and how much money are we looking at?
So the Tip of the Iceberg report was the third report that we did in a series looking at the anti-gender, anti-rights movement. The first report was entitled Restoring the Natural Order and was about how this network is organized at a transnational level through a network called Agenda Europe, and how they had been launching different initiatives in different countries during a more than a decade-long period. And so this is how we saw different things happening that looked like each other in different countries at the same time. This allowed us to understand we're not dealing with social conservatism at a grassroots level, but a coordinated strategic advocacy effort by a certain number of organizations and individuals. So that was the first report. People understood what was happening now. And then the request that we got a lot was, well, Neil, what about the funding behind this report, behind this network? And so that was the next thing we decided to look into. And so what we did was take a look at all the different anti-gender actors that we could identify operating in Europe. We identified over 120 of them in the big Europe. So that means, from Iceland all the way to Azerbaijan and not the EU. And 120 of them. And then we simply did the very down and dirty work of trying to find their annual accounts, their turnovers, their balance sheets, and all of these things. And we found it for 53 of these organizations. So that's in part why we say tip of the iceberg, so that the numbers we have are very incomplete, but they are solid. They come from publicly available information. And so what we found was a certain number of things. We took a look at the period 2009 to 2018. So it's a decade-long period. And we thought that's a rather elegant period. It's 2 mandates of the European Parliament or of the Commission. So like this, we can see how things evolve over time. And over this decade-long period, we found a number of things. One, we can confidently say that there's at least $700 million going into this anti-gender, anti-rights movement over this decade. When we take a look at the evolution over time, at the start of the decade, we're at about $20 million a year. By the end of the decade, we're at $80 million plus a year. So we can see that this movement has been able to quadruple its fundraising appeal over a decade-long period. So if you have 4 times more money after a decade than before, you can do more things, and this is what we're seeing. Third point that we saw was the geographic points of origin of the money. So out of the $700 million, we can find that there's about 12% that comes from the United States. So it's not a lot, but we always knew there was an American connection there. What I find interesting with the US money is that it's really concentrated in a few organizations that are specialized in litigation. So they take the US experience of taking issues through the judicial system, they're bringing that experience over to Europe. And let's just remember, in the US context, all of the social progress that we take for granted, such as access to contraception, abortion, equal marriage, these were never acts of the US Congress. These were decisions by the US Supreme Court. And overturning abortion was also a decision of the US Supreme Court just a few years ago. So they bring that experience to a European context. And we have examples of some of the things that they're doing. The next source of funding was the Russian Federation, accounting for about 25% of the 700 million. And there we saw it really is concentrated in two directions. One is support for far-right populist parties across Western Europe, and another is through two Russian oligarchs who have created what academics refer to as influence factories. So these are NGOs for media, different high-level events, which are meant to gradually socialize Western economic, political, and social elites onto a pro-Russian agenda. And this pro-Russian agenda is that Russia is the authentic defender of Christian and European values in Europe. And as a counter model to the degenerate gay Western European model that is espoused by the European Union. This is in Russian, from a Russian perspective. The third source of funding was Europe itself, which accounts for about 2/3 of all the funding for anti-gender activism in Europe. And there we have a bit what you already referred to as a bit beneath the iceberg, which is take a look at where does the European money come from. We find a certain number of sources. I mean, there's some public money going into this. We have seen a number of anti-rights, anti-gender actors develop their own crowdfunding platforms. We also see connections with religious movements and elites, and also we see very clearly the involvement of European wealthy people or corporations, what's commonly referred to as the 1%. And so we can see there's a certain modern 1%, so the heads of big multinationals or big corporations. But in Europe, we have a specificity. Part of our 1% is also very old families in some countries who have an aristocratic background, and where they may have lost political power over 100 years ago, they did not necessarily lose economic power. And we see that these families are involved through private foundations that they control and that they are contributing to this movement. So this is broadly what Tip of the Iceberg highlights.
So I'd like to pivot to what we got into in the beginning of our conversation, the part where we go beneath the iceberg and look at that part. What are the key funding sources and resource mobilization mechanism for anti-gender movements in Europe, in addition to those which you have already mentioned, of course?
So the main sources of financing from Europe itself, there's a certain number of them. One is public funding. Another one is crowdfunding. Another one is the elites, which we've talked about a little bit. And another one is proximity to religious communities and networks. So then if we take a look at those different sources of funding, one in terms of public funding, we see that a number of anti-rights, anti-gender organizations are getting state taxpayer money, okay? So that in a number of countries, if we start way down, it's local or regional organizations who are able to get state funding, basically for crisis pregnancy centers. So these are fake health centers that claim to offer an alternative to abortion, often by dissuading or misinforming women about their health options if they are pregnant. Okay, we see this type of operations in Slovakia, Italy, Spain, and even the Netherlands had it, with all of them with public funding. Then if we go higher up, we see that there's also a big new influx of public funding in perhaps a couple of directions. One of them is public funding for far-right political parties who have anti-gender, anti-rights initiatives at their core. A number of these political parties are relatively new, but they've been doing rather well electorally. And what happens is that in a number of countries, they are then able to tap into state funding. And in some cases, they're able to tap into an additional layer of funding, which is to establish a political foundation or a think tank. So this is one of the new developments that we're working on in our new report now, which is a whole new range of funding from taxpayers, which is going to far-right political parties and their associated think tank / political foundations. So we have this coming from Spain, the EU, and a number of other countries. These think tanks operating at the national level then team up, form European level alliances, and produce new, knowledge is not a good word, but new discourses which feed into an anti-rights, anti-gender agenda. And then the third source of funding is deliberate funding from states which are slipping into authoritarianism in order to create an echo chamber that supports their ideas.
So I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier,
Mm-hmm.
and that is your forthcoming publication this year, I believe, called The Next Wave.
Yes.
Can you tell us about it? Can you tell us about your preliminary findings?
Happy to share that. So we're working on an update of the report, Tip of the Iceberg. We're calling this updated report The Next Wave, and which updates the funding figures behind the anti-gender, anti-rights movement. So some of the main things that we're able to find, and so I should start by saying that we're taking a look at the period covering 2018 to 2022. Okay. So everything I say is for that period and perhaps a bit more recent. But the funding figures are for that period. Well, first, we're able to find a drastic increase in funding. Okay. So we had found $700 million for the decade between 2009 and 18. For the 5 years that 2018 to the present, we're finding that there's at least $880 million, okay, if not up to $1 billion. So we're talking more than doubling of the amount of funding for the anti-gender, anti-rights movement. And we see this by the expansion of the movement to new countries, also new types of organizations, and the existing organizations are by and large getting wealthier. So that's one of the new findings.
Thank you for those insights into your current research. These numbers are truly staggering, and even more devastatingly, as you have found, they're actually increasing.
Yes. Yeah.
This leads me into my next question. What opportunities do you see that exist for mobilizing progressive change at the EU level and beyond to counter these efforts? How do we push back?
That's an excellent question. How do we resist? How do we push back? I think at two levels. One, at a very meta level, is that we need to understand that we're no longer talking about just women's rights or LGBT rights. We're not talking about essentially niche areas. We're talking about preserving democracy and a certain level of society. Okay, so we need to be speaking at that level. Secondly, there are some very practical things that we can be doing, and I've tried to divide them up into 5 areas of action, which each one starts with a D. Okay. The first one is discover. Okay. We need to invest intellectual capacity in understanding this movement because it is quickly evolving. We need to invest in research to discover who the actors are, what are they doing, what areas are they going into, so that, for example, in terms of abortion, we know that their strategy will not be to contest abortion head-on in most cases. Rather, their strategy on abortion is a threefold one, which is prevent, restrict, prohibit. And so By prevent, they mean to dissuade women from accessing abortion services, okay? Not encouraging access to contraception. So it's a broad enough framework that you can deploy it in the most progressive countries. So we need to understand what their strategies are in terms of discover. Next one is disarm. Once we know who they are, how they function, this group is a group of litigators, this one is a petitions platform, etc., then we will be able to understand what their actions are, how important they are. If it's an organization of 2 million euros, you deal with it in a certain way, then which is different than an organization with a turnover of 50,000 euros. Okay. You need to know who they are, how important they are, and then like this, you will be able to disarm them. Okay, one good example of this is that an event we did in the French National Assembly last year, when they had debates around enshrining abortion in the French Constitution. So we did an event where we explained to parliamentarians, these are the different anti-gender actors who will be campaigning against abortion. This is what they will do, and you can anticipate that they will be acting this way. We were not able to stop them from doing this, but at least when they did this, all the policymakers were able to contextualize the action and understand where it was coming from and how important or unimportant it was. So that's in terms of disarm. A third point is dislocate. These actors want to be close to power. And so we need to be mindful of who they are, how they operate, and really try to limit their access to power. We've already helped block one or two organizations from accessing multilateral institutions through some sort of consultative status. Fourth area is demonetize. Once we know what their funding is like, we can work on specific strategies to strip away their funding. First, from state funding, that's taxpayer money, it shouldn't be going towards that. And then for private money, we could explore different accountability campaigns. And then finally is the fifth D, which is defend. We need to spend more effort on defending the frontline people who are really working to counter these organizations. One example that I use often is the head of the women's strike in Poland, Marta Lempart. So she's the lady that actually organizes the big marches of women in favor of abortion rights and democracy. She has been personally the subject of over 100 lawsuits by different anti-gender actors. Now, this drains you of energy, and that's the purpose of it. Okay, we need to understand what is happening and find mechanisms to support these frontline defenders. And then separately, we also need to take a look at the rights that we think are important and ask ourselves, are these actually guaranteed as rights in our legal frameworks? What we'll find is that if you take abortion, for example, in the vast majority of European countries, abortion is technically not a right. It remains regulated by the criminal code so that it remains a crime, which will go unpunished if women go through a certain specific procedure. Okay, is that really a woman's right as we think of abortion, or do we need to update our legislative frameworks to reflect that? This is what the French have done last year, and this is what a number of other countries should be thinking about in the near future. I think, so if I can summarize, discover, disarm, dislocate, demonetize, and then defend.
And that's all for today's episode of Backlash Unfiltered, pushing forward for equality in times of change. For more information and resources, check the links in the podcast description. Thanks for listening and stay tuned for the next episode.